the media, this is a place where you're going to hear the Socialist case for exiting the EU. And without further ado, I will introduce Sarah Rack, who's the editor of the Socialist paper, to introduce us in this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Issa. Well, I imagine that people have been following what's happening with the EU referendum in the media, and will have seen in the last week or so particularly that there have been a number of polls that have shown Brexit gaining and being ahead, even quite sizably ahead. I'm not going to make an exact prediction about what's going to happen in the vote next Thursday, because I think, well, as the saying goes, a week's a long time in politics. But I think we can at least say that it's definitely looking like it might be very close. And that idea has sent the establishment into absolute panic. And they've really stepped up their Project Fear to try and scare people into voting Remain. But that is completely not working at all. In fact, it's pushing people in the opposite direction. And apart from anything else, I think that is because who wants to be told what to do by Cameron and Osborne? The same Cameron and Osborne who've inflicted brutal austerity on working class people over the last 6 years. To the extent where we've had 1 million people having to feed themselves by going to food banks, young people unable to move out of their parents' home because of the high cost of housing, the scourge of 0-hour contracts on the rise, the horrific number of suicides that have been as a result of benefit cuts, and so on and so on. So they tell us that the economy will be at risk if there's a Leave vote. They say the NHS will be at risk if there's a Leave vote. Migrants will be at risk, jobs will be at risk, pensions will be at risk, and so on and so on. And why is that not working? Because all of those things are already being viciously attacked by the very people who are telling us those doom and gloom stories. If you try and tell the Welsh steelworker potentially facing redundancy as Tata gets sold, having to fight to not lose a lot of the pension entitlement that he's built up, facing the further destruction of a community already decimated by the closure of the mines and more recently the public sector cuts, try and tell that worker that the EU protects jobs and protects pensions and that the EU is what poor regions of the country like Wales need to rely on. Because in reality, people with nothing or very little to lose can't easily be scared into submission. And instead, what we're seeing is working class people, and the polls do show that working class people are more likely to be voting Leave. They're seeing an opportunity to kick back against that onslaught that we faced. They see Cameron and Osborne, the leadership of the Tories, desperate for a Remain vote. They see that they've staked their own futures, their political careers on a Remain vote, and they see, therefore, that Leave would be a serious defeat for the leadership of the Tory party. Not the whole Tory party, obviously, in some ways the less far-sighted elements of the Tory party, and yes, the more openly reactionary elements have been campaigning for Leave, along with UKIP, obviously, and that is probably the main reason that some working class and young people feel reluctant to join that vote as well. But the Socialist Party has been clear from the very start of the campaign that a Leave vote would split the Tories and could oust Cameron from being Prime Minister. Some people respond to us, but that's not enough, because if we get Cameron out, then all we get is Boris Johnson in, and he's much worse than Cameron. But we say that we have to take advantage of every opportunity that there is, that we have to try and force every split into an open break. And that if the situation is taken advantage of by the full strength of working class people, even if Johnson was Prime Minister, which isn't at all guaranteed, because in that situation there'd be an almighty fight within the Tory party about who was going to be the leader. But even if he was, he would be in an even weaker position than David Cameron is now. And David Cameron is in a very weak position now. Let's not forget he's got a majority of only 12 in Parliament, and the Tory party was elected with just 24% of the electorate voting for it in the last election. And Boris Johnson, it would be even worse for him. He would potentially be leader of a party where there would be actual splits in the party that he's trying to govern. So we don't accept either, though, that the choice is just between Cameron and Johnson, or, for that matter, that there is as big a gap as it's being suggested between those two figures. And what we actually think is that there's a big possibility that they would be forced to call a general election in the event of a Leave vote, which, if the Labour Party fought that general election on the basis of the programme that won Corbyn the Labour leadership campaign, the programme of a £10 an hour minimum wage, of building council housing, of rent control, of an end to cuts and privatisation, could mean that we have an anti-austerity government by Christmas. None of those things are guaranteed. We can't offer a guarantee on those. But it would present an opportunity for the workers' movement. And I think if Cameron did go, which everyone has agreed that he would have to if there was a Leave vote, that confidence of working class people would be very high, that we would feel, you know, we've got rid of this guy who's been doing these terrible things to us for all these years. And like I say, it's widely agreed that that's what would have to happen if there was a Leave vote. There's been Tory after Tory, in fact, saying Cameron can't survive in the event of a Leave vote. And the way that I see it is the alternative to that, to the workers' movement putting forward a strong working class Leave alternative, is that the workers' movement instead boosts the vote for Remain and attempts to therefore solidify Cameron's leadership, put him in a position of strength from which he can continue that brutal austerity programme, and suggest to working class people that the only option they have is to wait another 4 years for a general election before we have a chance to get the Tories out. The Socialist Party has been in a minority in putting this forward, particularly amongst organised groups on the left of politics. So sometimes we've had a bit of a surprise reaction when we say to people that we're campaigning for a Leave vote. Although I would say from working class people, from ordinary working class people, it's not mainly hostility to that idea, it's interest, because it's not something that they've heard about before, because they've not heard the socialist case. It's referenced in the mainstream media that Jeremy Corbyn used to in the past be against the EU, and that he's changed his position. But there's no discussion on why he used to be against the EU. There's no discussion on why, in fact, in the past, the vast majority of socialists were campaigning against the EU. And that lack of discussion, I think, has allowed a whole number of myths about the European Union to develop. There's a myth that the EU represents a softer type of capitalism than that of the Tories. But it doesn't at all. Just ask the working class of Greece, of Spain, Portugal, Ireland and so on, where the institutions of the EU have insisted on absolutely savage austerity packages in return for the so-called bailouts that have been given to those countries, insisting on the slashing of jobs and pay, privatising anything that moves, restricting trade union rights and so on. And that's probably been most clear in the example of Greece, where workers have resoundingly twice rejected austerity. First, by electing a Syriza government on an anti-austerity programme, and second, by voting against the EU's austerity memorandum in the referendum at the start of last year. And the Syriza leadership, they thought that they would be able to negotiate their way out of this situation. They'd be able to convince the EU to please be a bit nicer to Greece, that they could show the strength of their argument and the feeling of the Greek people. Well, within 6 months they were completely crushed. They capitulated entirely, and they're now implementing all of the EU's demands exactly like every other Greek party had done. Because they weren't willing to go all the way and to break with the EU and to begin a socialist change in Greece. And that process isn't just about negotiations and wranglings taking place in Brussels. That has real consequences for ordinary people in Greece, and it's been absolutely devastating process for them. Unemployment rate of 25%, a youth unemployment rate of 50%, a 1/3 drop in wages, a skyrocketing of prostitution. There were the reports of, in some cases, just €2 a time being charged by absolutely desperate women on the streets of Athens. And in reality, that is what the so-called EU's nicer capitalism looks like in reality. Some people say, but that's a poorer country with a different type of economy, and here it's different. But we'd argue that it's not only in the worst austerity-ridden cases, but that is the very nature of what the EU is about. So, for example, the competition rules of the EU demand privatisation, place obstacles in the way of nationalisation. The Posted Workers Directive means that companies are allowed to pay workers less than the minimum wage in the country that they're working in, super exploiting the workers from poorer EU countries and undermining the pay of all workers. Another myth that's perpetuated is that we should vote Remain because it's better to be linked up internationally, that we don't want to be isolationists, little Englanders, that kind of idea. And of course the working class should be linked up internationally, and we don't want to be isolationists, little Englanders. But what does that have to do with EU membership? When the Greek people were fighting for their very lives, really, against that EU-imposed austerity, where was the solidarity from David Cameron? Of course, that's a ludicrous question, because we all know that David Cameron agrees exactly with what was being done. Instead, the solidarity comes from working class people, sometimes in a bottom-up way through the structures of their trade unions and so on. Why would that stop if the UK wasn't in the EU? Because in reality, solidarity isn't about official institutions, it's about a working class instinct that we have more in common with workers in other countries than we do with the bosses and the pro-capitalist politicians here. Did not having a shared institution like the EU prevent us from showing solidarity to the victims, for example, of the bombing in Syria carried out by Western governments? No, it didn't. It was us, it was socialists and trade unionists who organised the marches and the lobbying and the fundraising and so on. And we stand for that international solidarity of working class people fighting against austerity and fighting for a socialist alternative. And in opposition to that, the only solidarity that the EU offers is solidarity between the ruling classes of Europe to crush any resistance from workers and young people. So while workers stood in solidarity with the Greek working class, the EU institutions were used for the various national governments of the richer European countries to combine their strength to ensure that the Greek people were crushed into the dirt. So, given all those points, I think that it's a dereliction of duty, really, that most of the leaders of the trade unions, and unfortunately along with Jeremy Corbyn, are supporting and campaigning for a Remain vote. And a common argument from them, which is kind of being pushed increasingly towards the end of the campaign, as Cameron in fact has realised that what they need to do is concentrate on getting the working class vote out, and has kind of handed over the reins to the trade union leadership and to the Labour Party. And what they're emphasising is this idea that EU legislation is a key safeguard against Tory attacks on workers' rights. And of course I think that actually the Greek workers would probably argue that legal rights aren't that much good when you're homeless, jobless and destitute. But apart from that, if we look at what EU laws actually mean for workers' rights here in Britain, firstly, there's the absolute lie that most workers' rights have come from Europe initially, because even those in EU law tend to have originated in national laws that have been won by struggles of working class people. Many of them were law in Britain before we joined the EU. Some are even better in the UK. So for example, in the UK, you're entitled to 5.6 weeks of paid holiday. EU law entitles you to 4 weeks of paid holiday. Equal pay is one that's often referenced. In Britain, that was won as a result of strikes, particularly of the Ford Dagenham workers shown in the Made in Dagenham film. And I think the idea that it was given to us by the capitalist governments to make up the EU it's not just nonsense, but it's also a very dangerous idea for the trade unions to be perpetuating, when in fact they are the only bodies capable of winning that kind of reform. And even the few laws that have come from the EU first have to be incorporated into the laws in each individual country. So what it would require is Parliament to revoke each of those laws one by one. Do we think that the government, post a Leave vote, would be feeling so confident that they would start working their way through all of those protections and revoking them? Do we think that workers would sit idly by and watch those protections be taken away? I certainly don't. And I've also got confidence in the strength of the working class to resist any such move to do that. Just look at all the U-turns that the Tories have been forced into in the recent period by the strength of campaigning. And the final myth, and perhaps the one that has had biggest influence in this campaign, is that we have to support the EU because of migrant workers. And I think it's a very understandable fear, particularly given the real racist bile that's been spewed from the official leaders of both campaigns actually in this debate, but particularly the leaders of the Leave campaign. But I also really do think that anyone watching the brutal treatment by the EU of the refugees being deported from Greece to Turkey, the closure of the camps, the desperate people throwing themselves into the sea because of the actions of Fortress Europe, it's therefore hard to make the claim that the EU stands up for migrants and against racism. And the idea that those policies is completely unrelated to the rise of the right and the far right across various European countries is complete nonsense. But here in Britain, EU migrant workers do understandably worry about where they would stand in a post-EU Britain. But even Nigel Farage says that everyone here at the moment should be able to stay, showing that even the most reactionary forces don't have the confidence that they could try and move to be deporting workers who are here at the moment. There'd also be no change to the rules for 2 years while negotiations took place. And part of those negotiations, obviously working class people could have an impact on those negotiations. We could lead big movements against any attacks. Part of it would also be big business trying to guarantee that they can still get the European workers that they need to make their ultra profits. But any attacks on the rights that exist would have to be really fought ferociously by the trade union and labour movement, and the Socialist Party would place ourselves at the forefront of that. Just as we are also against the attacks that are already taking place, because let's not forget that the whole referendum started with Cameron going to Europe, having these negotiations, so-called, with other European leaders about how much he can get away with attacking the EU workers who live in Britain at the moment in terms of their entitlements to benefits and so on. And that was an attempt to say, don't worry, we don't have to leave the EU to be able to attack migrants, we can do it anyway. That is what they're already doing. So, taking all those things into account, then what is the best way to express international solidarity? What is the best way to defend workers' rights? What is the best way to defend migrants? And what I'd say is that the status quo, as things are at the moment, is not doing those things. The Trade Union Act has just been passed. That is the biggest assault on workers' rights for a generation. UKIP is growing here, and similar forces are growing in other European countries. But even if you think that the status quo is better than a leap into the dark, what we know is better, that's not what the choice is in front of us, because the status quo isn't going to remain as it is. Political turmoil is a fact. That is the future in the short, medium, and I'd say long term. So the choice facing us actually is, do we desperately try to cling on to the situation that exists now, which is a Tory government led by David Cameron implementing terrible austerity and whipping up racism, or do we try and force a change in a direction that's best for the working class? And I think that's the mistake that Jeremy Corbyn has made, that he's failed to put an independent working class position or to outline the debate on different terms than what's being put forward in the mainstream. He should be putting forward, as the Socialist Party is, that the EU is not reformable, that it can never be one for workers. But instead we need international workers' solidarity across Europe and beyond to fight for a socialist confederation of European states on an entirely voluntary basis. What's desperately missing from the mainstream, I think, from the mainstream debate, is that idea of what is a socialist alternative. We've had big business people appearing on the TV and quoted in the newspapers saying that if Britain leaves the EU, that's economic Armageddon, and they are going to take their company out of the country and they're going to sack thousands of workers. Where is the voice in response to that saying, no you won't, because we're going to nationalise your company under democratic workers' control to save those jobs, services and production? Instead, the Labour and the trade union leaders are echoing exactly those same arguments. They're telling people jobs will be lost. Well, not if they put up a fight, they won't be. And of course the issue behind that is, I think, the civil war within the Labour Party and the fact that it's still not resolved. And unfortunately, that Jeremy Corbyn and those around him are still failing to fight to the extent that's going to be needed against the Blairite wing of the Labour Party, which in reality is still waiting to knife them in the back as soon as they think it would be of benefit to them. I think what we can definitely say is that after next Thursday, things won't be the same. Whatever the result is, it will be a new situation. And I think the referendum has definitely brought out the splits that exist within both the main parties. And it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for them to try and put themselves back together in the aftermath of the referendum. And what's more, if there's a Leave vote, or even a narrow Remain vote, it would leave Cameron and the Tory party very exposed, and I think working class people very confident. And we've got a responsibility as socialists and trade unionists and activists to try and use that balance of forces to press home the advantage, to reinvigorate the anti-austerity movement, including mass demonstrations, a 24-hour general strike, and that type of thing. But we also have to fight for a strong political voice for working class people, whether that comes from the Corbyn surge that's taken place inside the Labour Party combining with forces outside, or whether it comes from another direction. Because we have to ensure that when this kind of debate takes place about our future, that working class people as a whole are able to have a say in it and to shape the way that debate develops. And also to fight for a socialist alternative to the absolute brutality of capitalism and all the consequences of that, the nationalism, the racism and the war that it breeds. And I think it's that type of movement, with that type of programme and strategy, that can actually have an impact in preventing further attacks on workers' rights, in reversing the attacks that have taken place, in preventing attacks on migrants and cutting across the development of racism, and in defeating austerity once and for all.
Thank you. And just to kind of mention to everyone,